Welcome back, everybody. Today I'm going to be doing a valve adjustment on my 2003 Honda Element. This will be the same for any Element 2003 to 2011. Valve adjustments are really important on these. It's recommended every 110,000 miles you do it, but a lot of people wait and they don't ever adjust the valves. If you neglect your valve adjustments, the first thing that's going to happen is your gas mileage is going to go way down because your exhaust valves are going to be really tight. Eventually, it'll start stalling on you, which has happened to me before, and it's not fun. You're driving and you let your foot off the gas and all of a sudden it just stalls. And then sometimes, which this happens a lot, you'll end up burning an exhaust valve, and it's cheaper to just replace the engine than to put a new cylinder head on it. So trust me, you gotta adjust your valves. I'm gonna walk you through step by step on how to do it on this car. So let's get into it. To start, you're gonna take a 10mm socket. I don't like to use power tools because it's all really small bolts. And start with these two bolts. Then you simply just lift this cover up, set it to the side. Now you can take off these 4 bolts holding on this plastic cover. Then lift this cover off. Now I'm going to take off the 6 bolts holding the valve cover on. Same 10mm wrench. Now I'm going to pry off all these metal caps and the rubber gaskets underneath. Now you can use the same 10mm, you want a long one, to get these coil pack bolts off. And then you can disconnect and pull out the coils. Now there's a bolt behind this power steering hose that holds this bracket on. I'm going to take that bolt off and pop this hose off. Pop the hose off first, take the bolt off, take this clamp away. Then you can pull out the dipstick. And then right here, there's a bolt right here and right here, 10mm. Take those off and then get a pair of pliers and squeeze this clamp and pull out this hose. Now the valve cover is pretty much ready to come off. I did not take the spark plugs out yet. I'm going to do that after because I worry that when I lift this cover off, some dirt might fall in, and I don't mind if it gets in the oil, but I don't want it to go down the spark plug tube. So I'm going to take this cap off. So now I'll just try to wiggle this valve cover off. I think I actually broke it loose when I took this bolt off. Sometimes you have to get a screwdriver or a pry bar and pry it up a little bit at a time, but this actually is loose. Here's what inside of the valve cover looks like. The valve cover gasket is probably original. I'm definitely going to replace it. It's all flattened out. Now the next step in here is going to be to take the spark plugs out. I've got my spark plug socket. It's a 5/8, and it's a spark plug socket because it has that rubber gasket inside to hold the spark plug so you can pull it out, and a long extension. So I'm just going to start and make sure I remember which spark plug was where. The spark plugs all look fine. I don't think they're original, but they are the correct NGK. If they're original, this burning would be like almost all the way up. This car has 230,000 miles. And I don't feel like wasting $80 on spark plugs when there's nothing wrong with these. So I'm going to end up putting those back in. But the reason I took the spark plugs out is because we have to turn the motor, and it's way easier to turn if there's no spark plugs. Now it does help to have good lighting. I've got that spotlight and that light above me. I would not recommend this just doing it out in like a cloudy day or in a dark garage. It's now time to actually start adjusting the valves. So if you come up here, this sticker will show you the intake lash and the exhaust lash. And this is cold. I should have mentioned this in the beginning. You have to do this on a cold engine. You can't drive it like to a mechanic shop or a mobile mechanic and then all of a sudden he does the adjustment, because it won't be Correct. You need to have a cold engine that's been sitting for several hours. So the intake is 0.23, the exhaust is 0.3 inches. I got these feeler gauges at AutoZone. Now the closest one to 0.23 for the intake, I'm going to use this, and I'm going to end up using this one for the exhaust. Alright, so first I'm going to start with the intake, which is the front of the engine. And I'm using a pretty long 19 millimeter. And I'm going to put it on the power steering pump here. And this is how I will turn the engine. To start off here, I'll start with cylinder 1 intake. This is 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I have to turn the engine until this lobe comes up to the top. So you can see I got this cam lobe up at the very top of the engine. Now I can take my feeler gauge. This is the 0.008 inches, I believe, and 0.203 millimeters. I'm going to be feeling right here. So I'm going to start with the intake. Now I've done probably 12 or so valve adjustments on elements and Accords of the same engine. The intakes really never need to be adjusted. I check them anyways. It's always the exhaust that has problems, but it's easier to demonstrate on the intake. So I'll take my feeler gauge, I'll stick it right in here, and in this case it actually is too tight. This is actually the first element I've done where the intake is too tight. I can't get this smallest feeler gauge in. I can, but there's way too much resistance. This should slide freely, but with minimal drag. And there's a lot of drag on this right side. I can barely get it out, and I couldn't even get the left side in. So we have to loosen these up a bit. This is the specialty valve adjustment tool that you can find on Amazon. Personally, I hate this thing. I've tried it a few times. I think it's really only good for V6 engines where it's a really weird angle. But for elements, I'll show you the method I prefer. If you were to use this tool, you would crack the nut open, loosen this screwdriver, and then tighten it. But I don't like it. I'll show you what I use. I just use a screwdriver, a small 10 millimeter wrench, and this wrench just to crack the nuts free, because you'll probably bust your knuckles if you just try to use this wrench. So I'm just going to crack this nut loose with this first. Alright, now that I've cracked this nut free, I'm going to take my feeler gauge. Fit my feeler gauge under here. You can see it doesn't fit in. So the gap is too tight. I'll take my screwdriver, turn it a little bit. Now the feeler gauge fits. So I'm just gonna loosen this a little bit. And you don't want to be pushing down like on the screwdriver, because that will push down and not let this feeler gauge move. Right here where it was too tight. I loosened it just that much, and now the feeler gauge slides through, and you can hear there's minimal drag, and that's just what you want. So I'm going to remember this angle for now, make sure it doesn't move. Then feed my screwdriver through here. I'm going to hold the screw exactly where it was, and then bring this down. This actually might be a good example where that tool will come in handy. I take it back. That tool will come in handy right now because I don't have enough play with this wrench to tighten it. So I'm gonna go back to that tool. So I'm just holding the screw where it was, tightening the nut. Now I'll take my feeler gauge, and you can see it fits and it slides, and there's a little bit of drag, which is good. And I only turn this 1/8 of a turn around. That's all it needed. So that's what you want. Now I'll move on to this one. This one was just a wee bit tight. So I loosen the nut. Still too tight. Loosen the screw just a little bit. Now the feeler gauge fits with minimal drag. I'm just going to tighten it right there. Now I'll just check both of these again. That's perfect. And that's perfect. So now I'm just gonna move on. If you want, you can do 1, 2, 3, 4. You could do number 1 intake, number 1 exhaust, number 2, but then you have to keep switching feeler gauges and that gets complicated. So I'm gonna do cylinder 3 next, just because when I'm spinning it, and you always want to spin it this direction the same way I'm going, so you want to move your wrench up towards the front of the car. So now cylinder 3 lobe is up, and I'm not gonna show you everything for the intake. I mean, it's gonna be the same for each cylinder. I'll update you when I move to the exhaust. I just wanted to show you what a typical intake valve clearance will look like before you even adjust it. This is cylinder 3. I didn't have to adjust anything. The feeler gauge just fits in here perfectly with minimal drag. So that's how it typically is when I do an intake. This side is the same way. Alrighty, I finished the intakes. Cylinder 3 was the only one that I didn't have to adjust. All the other ones, I had to do like 1/8 of a turn, just loosening the screw, and I was able to fit the feeler gauge in. So now I can move on to the exhaust side. This one's going to be a little bit harder to see, but it's the same principle. I have to get these wires out of the way. I might just bring them up here. I don't like tugging on this too much because the wires that come out of here go into the VTEC solenoid, and the pigtails on those always have issues. So I'm trying to be gentle when I'm prying this back. That should be good. I'm just gonna get cylinder 1 top dead center. It's already passed, so I am gonna go all the way around. I've got the new feeler gauge for the exhaust side. You can see the numbers right there. I can tell already the valves are too tight because I should be able to move this up and down and hear a click. And it should be a louder click than that, and there should be a little bit more play. So I guarantee that this feeler gauge is not even gonna fit. Yeah, not even close to fitting on either. These valves are definitely too tight. Before I loosen, I'm just gonna take note of the orientation of the screw and make sure it doesn't move. So the screw did not move with the nut, which is good. Now I can kind of gauge how many revolutions this is going to take to fit the feeler gauge in. Oh, and by the way, this is the connector that you get the P2646 or 47 because water drips in here and it corrodes this. That's going to be your problem. But now for the valve adjustment. Let's see, I'll give it a quarter turn. A quarter turn doesn't really help. Half a turn, and I'm finally able to fit the feeler gauge. And that's actually the perfect amount of drag that I want. That's perfect right there. Now I'm just gonna tighten it. Hold the screw steady. And I made sure to put the intake feeler gauge back so I didn't pick it up by accident when I'm doing this. That's perfect. Now to move on to the second one, on cylinder 1. It's way too tight. But I'll loosen that. Quarter turn. This gauge still doesn't fit. Another quarter turn, and it finally fits. It seems a little bit loose, so I'm gonna just barely tighten the screw. That's perfect right there. I can pull it, there's some drag. So I'm gonna take this feeler gauge out and tighten. Now you can hear, and you can actually see this rocker arm, I think that's what it's called, going up and down. That's the sound you wanna hear. When I started before, it was much quieter and you couldn't see any movement. So I'm just gonna go 1, I'm gonna do 3 next, because that lobe is gonna be up at the center, and then 4, and then 2. And I'll update you if anything major occurs. Quick update on cylinder 4 exhaust. It doesn't move at all. So, way too tight. I got all the valves adjusted. The back, that's what they should sound like after adjustment, not dead silent. Now all I have to do is clean up the surface where the valve cover gasket meets, and you'll see here, this is Honda Bond from either the last time somebody had the valve cover off or from the factory. So I'm just gonna pull all this out, and there's a little spot right here also. Now this is the old valve cover gasket, and I can see it's really compressed. I'm gonna put a new one on. So this just pulls out. I'm guessing this was replaced at some point, because usually when you pull them they crack, and this one's not cracking. But I'm still gonna replace it because it's a little bit on the hard side. Here's a new valve cover gasket. I already took it out of the bag, but I believe the part number for these is 12341 RTA000, because I buy them so often. But just gotta line this up. Now you have to take some Honda Bond, take a little bit, not too much. And you're gonna put it right here. There's a little seam. And that's all you need, just a wee bit. Put a little bit more right in that crack. Before I put the valve cover on, because I'm worried about dust falling in the spark plug tubes here, I'm gonna put the spark plugs in. Now I'm just going to go around. I'll put the oil cap in so I don't drop anything. And then I'll put the 6 caps and nuts back on. Now I didn't go too crazy on these bolts because the studs are very weak on all these cars. And if you tried to crank it tight, you'd break the stud. So now I'll put the dipstick in and the coils and plug them in and get them tightened down. I'm just gonna hook this hose back up, put those 2 screws back in, and then finish putting that plastic cover on. So that pretty much sums up this video. I spent about $12 on the valve cover gasket. The Honda bond was somewhere around $15, and I get a lot of uses out of that. If you take it to the Honda dealer, they'll charge about $350 or $400. Pretty much the going rate for this is $350 to $400, and it took me about 2 hours to do. It's honestly not that hard on the elements. It's a very easy angle to work with when you're leaning over. On the Accords, the cars are much lower and the engines are farther back, so it's super awkward to try to get to the exhaust valves. It's really not that bad at all. But to sum it up, definitely get your valves adjusted. Whether you pay somebody $400 or do it yourself, it's going to save you at least $2,000 in the long run when you have to replace the engine, versus if you just adjusted the valves, you wouldn't have to replace the engine. Thank you guys so much for watching.